Hello, I'm Dr. Nate Pennell, welcoming you to the first episode of our new podcast, ASCO Education by the Book. The podcast will feature engaging discussions between editors and authors from the ASCO Educational Book. Each month, you'll hear nuanced views on key topics in oncology featured in education sessions at ASCO meetings, as well as some deep dives on the advances shaping modern oncology. Although I am honored to serve as the editor-in-chief of the ASCO Educational Book, in my day job, I am the co-director of the Cleveland Clinic Lung Cancer Program and vice chair for clinical research for the Taussig Cancer Center here in Cleveland. I'm delighted to kick off our new podcast with a discussion featuring the EdBook's previous editor-in-chief. Dr. Dizon is a professor of medicine and surgery at Brown University and works as a medical oncologist specializing in breast and pelvic malignancies at Lifespan Cancer Institute in Rhode Island. Dr. Dizon also serves as the vice chair for membership and accrual at SWOG Cancer Research Network. Don, it's great to have you here for our first episode of ASCO Education by the Book.
Really nice to be here and to see you again, my friend.
This was the first thing I thought of when we were kicking off a podcast, that I thought we would set the stage for our hopefully many listeners to learn a little bit about what the EdBook used to be like, how it has evolved over the last 14 years or so since we both started here, and where it's going. You started as editor-in-chief in 2012, is that right?
Oh boy, I believe that is correct. Yes, I did 2 5-year stints as EIC of the Education Book. So that sounds about right, although you're aging me very clearly in this podcast.
I had to go back in my emails to see if I could figure out when we started on this, because we've been working on it for some time. Start out a little bit by telling you, what do you remember about the EdBook from back in the day? When you were applying to be editor-in-chief and thinking about the EdBook, what was it like at that time?
You know, it's so interesting to think about it. 10 years ago, it's longer than that now, we were both in a very different place in our careers. And I remember when the EdBook position came up, I had been writing a column for ASCO. I had done some editorial activities with other journals for sure. But what always struck me was it was very unclear how one was chosen to be part of the education program at ASCO. And then it was very unclear how those faculty were then selected to write a paper for the education book. And it was back in the day when the education book was completely printed. So there was this book that was cherished among American fellows in oncology. And it was one that when I was newly in attending, and certainly 2 or 3 years before the editor's position came up, it was one that I referenced all the time. So it was a known commodity for many of us. And there was a certain sense of selectivity about who was invited to write in it. And it wasn't terribly transparent either. So when the opportunity to apply for editor-in-chief of the education book came up, I had already been doing so much work for ASCO. I had been on the planning committees and served in many roles across the organization. And editing was something I found I enjoyed in other work. So I decided to put my name in the ring with the intention of sort of bringing the book forward, getting it indexed, for example, so that there was this credit that was more than just societal credit at ASCO. This ended up being something that was referenced and acknowledged as an important paper through PubMed indexing. And then also to provide it as a space where we could be more transparent about who was being invited, and also broadening the tent as to who could participate as an author on the EdBook.
It's going to be surprising to many of our younger listeners to learn that the education book used to be just this giant, almost like a brick. I mean, it was this huge tome of articles from the education sessions that you got when you got your meeting abstracts book at the annual meeting. And you can always see people on the plane on the way out of Chicago with their giant books.
Yes.
That added lots of additional weight to the plane, I'm sure, on the way out.
And it was not uncommon for us to be sitting at an airport and people would be reading those books with highlighters.
I fondly remember being a fellow and coming up, and the Ed book was always really important to me. So I was excited. We'll also let the listeners in on that. I also applied to be the original editor-in-chief of the Ed book back in 2012, although I was very junior and did not have any real editorial experience. I think I may have been section editor for the oncologist at that point. And I had spoken to Dr. Ramaswamy Govindan at WashU, who had been the previous editor-in-chief, about applying. And he was like, oh, yeah, you should absolutely try that out. And then when Dr. Dizon was chosen, I was like, oh, well, I guess I didn't get it. And then out of the blue, I got a call asking me to join as the associate editor, which was really always very thankful for that opportunity.
Well, it was a highly fruitful collaboration, I think, between you and I when we first started. I do remember taking on the reins and sort of saying, this is our vision of what we want to do. But then just working with the authors, which we did, about how to construct their papers and what we were looking for. All of that is something I look back really fondly on.
And I think it was interesting too, because neither one of us had really a lot of transparency into how things worked when we started. We kind of made it up a little bit as we went along. We wanted to get all of the faculty, or at least as many of them as possible, contributing to these. And we would go to the ASCO Education Committee meeting and kind of talk about the Ed book. And we were thinking about, how could we get people to submit? So at the time, it wasn't PubMed indexed. Most people, I think, submitted individual manuscripts just from their talk, which could be anywhere from full-length review articles to very brief manuscripts.
Sometimes it was their slides with like a couple of comments on it.
And some of them were almost like a summary of the talk. Yeah, exactly. And so sort of making that a little more uniform. There was originally an honorarium attached, which went away. But I think PubMed indexing was probably the biggest incentive for people to join. So I remember that was one of the first things you really wanted to get.
Yeah. And I was, it was fortuitous. I'd like to take all the credit for it, but ASCO was very forward thinking with Dr. Ramaswamy, and the conversations about going to PubMed with this had preceded my coming in. We knew what we needed to do to get this acknowledged, which was really strengthening the peer review so that these papers could meet the bar to get on PubMed. But, within the first, 2 or 3 years, Nate, of us doing this, we were able to get this accepted. And now it is. If you look at what PubMed did for us, it not only increased the potential of who was going to access it, but for, I think, the oncology community, it allowed people access to papers by key opinion leaders that was not blocked by a paywall. And I thought that was just super important at the time. And this was, social media was something, but it wasn't what it is now. But anybody could access these manuscripts, and it's still the case today.
I think it's hard to overstate how important that was. People don't realize this, but the Ed book is really widely accessed, especially outside the US as well. And a lot of people who can't attend the meeting to get the once print book could actually get access to essentially the education session from the annual meeting without having to fly all the way to the US to attend. Now, we have much better virtual meeting offerings now and whatnot. But at the time, it was pretty revolutionary to be able to do that.
Yeah. And, it's so interesting when I think back to, the sort of evolution to a fully online publication of the Ed book. It was really some requests from international participants of the annual meeting who really wanted to continue to see this in print. At that time, it was important to recognize that access to information was not uniform across the world. And people really wanted that print edition, maybe not for themselves, but so that access in more rural areas or access where the broadband networks were not established, that they still could access the book. But I think things have changed now. We were able, I think in your tenure, to see it fully go online. But even I just remember that being a concern as we went forward.
Yeah, we had for a while, we continued with the print book that was available if people asked for it. But apparently few enough people asked for it that it moved fully online. One of the major advantages of being fully online now is, of course, it does allow us to publish kind of in real time as the manuscripts come out in the months leading up to the meeting, which has been, I think, a huge boon because it can build momentum for the education sessions coming in. People, really look forward to it.
Yeah, that was actually a concern. When we were phasing out EdBook and going to this continuous publication model where authors actually had the ability to sort of revise their manuscript and that would be automatically uploaded. You had a static manuscript that was fully printed and it was no longer an accurate one. And we didn't have the ability to fix it. And it just goes to show exactly as you're saying, Nate, this idea that these are living papers was really an important thing that ASCO embraced quite early, I think.
And with the onset of PubMed indexing, the participation from faculty skyrocketed and almost within a couple of years was up to the vast majority of sessions and faculty participating. Now, I think people really understand that this is part of the whole process. But at the time, I remember writing out on my slides in all caps, this is an expectation. And that's about the best word I could give because I asked if we could make people do it. And they were like, no, you can't make people do it. So,
Right. And you actually, I don't think people are aware of the work on the back end. Every year when I was on as EIC, Nate and myself, and then subsequently Hope Barugo would have these informational sessions with the education faculty. And we would tout the ed book, tout the expectation, tout it was PubMed indexed, and tout multidisciplinary participation. So we were not seeing 4 manuscripts reflecting one session. This encouragement to really embrace multidisciplinary care was something that very early on we introduced and really encouraged people not to submit prospective manuscripts, but to really get them in and then harmonize the paper so that it felt like it was, one voice.
I consider that after PubMed indexing, the next major change to the ed book that really made it a better product. And that was moving from, just these short individual single author manuscripts to single session combined manuscript that had multiple perspectives and topics, really much more comprehensive review articles. And I don't even remember what the impetus was for that, but it was really a success.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the beginning, it was more of a challenge, I think, because people were really not given guidance on what these papers were supposed to look like. So we were seeing individual manuscripts come forward. Looking back, it really foreshadowed the importance of multidisciplinary management. But at the time, it was really more about ensuring that people were leaving the session with a singular message of what to do when you're in clinic again. And the goal was to have the manuscript reflect that sort of consensus view of a topic that was coming in. There were certain things that people still argued would not fit in a multidisciplinary manuscript. If you have someone who's writing and whose entire talk was on the pathology of thyroid cancer, another topic was on survivorship after thyroid cancer, it was hard to sort of get those two to interact and cover what was being covered. So we were still getting that. But you're right. At the end of my tenure and into yours, there were far fewer of those individual manuscripts.
And I think it's even made it easier to write because now, you just have to write a section of a manuscript and not put together an entire review. So it's helped with getting people on board.
Well, the other thing I thought was really interesting about the process is when you're invited to do an education session at ASCO, you're either invited as a faculty speaker or as the chair of the session. And the responsibilities of the chair is to ensure that it flows well and that the talks are succinct based on what the agenda or the objectives were as defined by the education committee for that specific group. But that was it. So really being named, quote, chair was sort of an honorific. It really didn't come with a responsibility. So we use the ed book as a way to say, as chair of the session, it is your responsibility to ensure a manuscript comes to me, but B, that the content of that paper harmonizes and is accurate. And it was very rare, but Nate, I think we got dragged into a couple of times where the accuracy of the manuscript was really called into question by the chair. And those were always very, very tricky discussions because everyone that gets invited to ASCO is a recognized leader in their field. Some of us, especially, I would probably say dating back 10 years from today, the data behind standards of care were not necessarily evidence based. So there was a lot of opinion based therapies, maybe not so much in medical side, but certainly some of it. But when you went to, surgical treatments and maybe even radiotherapy treatments, it was really based on my experience at my center is this, and this is why I do what I do. But those kinds of things ended up being some of the more challenging
Yes.
things to handle as an editor.
And that was, those are the, I'll use fun in a broad sense, every once in a while you get an article where it really does take a lot of hands-on work from the editor to work with the author to try to revise it and make it a suitable academic manuscript. But you know what? I can't think, at least in recent years, of any ones that we turned down. They just sometimes needed a little TLC.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other important thing that it reminds me of is how great it was that I wasn't doing this by myself because it was so great to be able to reach out to you and say, can you give me your take on this paper? Or can you help me just join a conference call with the authors to make sure that we're on the same page? And then on the rare example where we were going to reject a paper, it was really important that we, as the editorial team, and I include our ASCO shepherder through the whole process, we had to all agree that this was not salvageable. Unfortunately, it happened very rarely. But I gotta say, not doing this job alone was one of the more important facets of being the EIC of ASCO's education book.
Well, it's nice to hear you say that. I definitely felt that this was there was a partnership, it was a labor of love. So I want to go to what I consider sort of the third major pillar of the changes to the ed book during your tenure. And that was the introduction of a whole new kind of manuscript. So up to, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, all the articles were authored just by people who were presenting at the annual meeting. And then you had an idea to introduce invited manuscripts. So take me through that.
Yeah. Well, again, it went to this sort of what can people who are being asked to sort of lead ASCO for that year, what can they demonstrate as sort of a more tangible contribution to the society and to oncology in general? And I think that was the impetus to use the ed book for everyone who was in a leadership position to make their mark that said, I was here and I was either president of the society or I was education chair or a scientific program chair. And they got to select an article type that was not being covered in the annual meeting and suggest the authors and work with those authors to construct a manuscript. Never did any one of those folks suggest themselves, which I thought was fascinating. They didn't say, I want to be the one to write this piece because this was never meant to be a presidential speech or a commemorative speech or opportunity for them as leaders. But we wanted to ensure that whatever passion they had within oncology was represented in the book. And again, it was this sort of sense of I want everyone to look at the ed book and see themselves in it and see what they contributed. And that was really important for those who were really shepherding each annual meeting each year for ASCO, that they had the opportunity to do that. And I was really pleased that leadership really took to that idea and were very excited about bringing ideas and also author groups into the education book who would not have had the opportunity otherwise. And I thought that was just really nice. It was about inclusiveness and just making sure that people had the opportunity to say, if you want to participate, we want you to participate.
Yeah, I agree. I think the ASCO leadership jumped on this and continue to still really appreciate the opportunity to be able to kind of invite someone on a topic that's meaningful to them. I think we've tried to work in things that incorporate the presidential theme each year in our invited manuscript. So it really allows them to put kind of a stamp on the flavor of each edition. And the numbers reflect that these tend to be among our more highly read articles as well.
Looking back on what we did together, that was something I'm really, really quite proud of, that we were able to sort of help the education book evolve that way.
I agree. You brought up briefly a few minutes ago about social media and its role over time. I think when we started in 2012, I think I just joined Twitter, now X, in 2011. And I think we were both sort of early adopters in the social media. Do you feel like social media has had a role in the growth of the ed book, or is this something that you think we can develop further?
When we were doing EdBook together, professional social media was actually a quite identified space. We were all in the same platform. We analyzed what the outcomes were on that platform, and our communities gathered on that platform. So it was a really good place to highlight what we were publishing, especially as we went to continuous publishing. I mean, I don't remember if it was you or me, but we even started asking our authors for a tweet, and those tweets needed work.
Right.
It was you. It was you who was actually leading these tweets to say, "Yeah, we need to just work on this." But I think it's harder today. There's no one preferred platform. Alternate platforms are still evolving. So I think there is opportunities there. The question is that opportunity meaningful enough for the ed book to demonstrate its return on an investment, for example? What I always thought about social media, and it's still true today, is that it will get eyes on whatever you're looking at far beyond who you intended to see it. So, your tweets regarding a phase 3 clinical trial in lung cancer, which were so informative, were reaching me, who is not a lung oncologist, who doesn't even see lung cancer, and getting me more interested in finding that article, and more pointing to the education book content that speaks to that piece. And I think coupling an impression of the data, associating that with something that is freely accessed, is, I think, a golden opportunity, not only for our colleagues, but also for anyone who's interested in that topic. Either you're diagnosed with that cancer, or you're taking care of someone with that cancer, or you heard about that cancer. There are people who would like to see information that is relevant and vetted and delivered by people who know what they're talking about. And I think our voices on social media are important because of it. And I think that's where the contribution is. So if we had to see what the metric was for any social media efforts, it has to be more of the click rates, not just by ASCO members, but the click rates across societies and across countries.
Yeah, social media is, obviously evolving quite a bit in the last couple of years. But I do know that in terms of like the alt metrics for the track access through social media and online, the ones that are shared online by the authors, by the EdBook team, do seem to get more attention. I think a lot of people don't like to just sit with a print journal anymore or an email table of contents for specific journals. People find these articles that are meaningful to them through their network. And oftentimes that is online on social media.
Yes, 100%. And what I think we should encourage people to do is look at the source. And if the ed book becomes a source of information, I think that will be a plus to the conversations in our world. We're still dealing with a place where, depending on who sponsored the trial, whether it was an industry sponsored trial, whether it was NCI sponsored or sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, for example, access to the primary data sets may or may not be available across the world, but the ed book is. And if the ed book can summarize that data and use terms and words that are accessible no matter what your grade level of education is, if we can explain the graphs and the figures in a way that people can actually easily more understand it, if there's a way that we structure our conversations in the ed book so that the plethora of inclusion, exclusion criteria are summarized and simplified, then I think we can achieve a place where good information becomes more accessible. And we can point to a summary of the source data in places where the source is not available.
One of the other things that I continue to be surprised at how popular these are podcasts. And that gives you an opportunity, pretty much the opposite. Instead of sort of a nugget that directs you to the source material, you've got a more in-depth discussion of the manuscript. And so I'm delighted that we have our own podcast. For many years, the Ed Book would sort of do a Weird Al takeover of the ASCO Daily News podcast for a couple of episodes around the annual meeting. And I think those were always really popular, enough that we were able to argue that we deserved our own podcast. And I'm really looking forward to having these in-depth discussions with authors.
It's an amazing evolution of where the Ed Book has gone, right? We took it from print only, societally only, to something that is now accessed worldwide via PubMed. We took it from book to fully online print. And now I think making the content live is a natural next step. So I applaud you for doing the podcast and giving people an opportunity to actually discuss what their article discusses. And if there's a controversial point, giving them the freedom and the opportunity to sort of give the more nuanced views on what may not be something that there's 100% consensus over.
Yes. Well, I hope other people enjoy these as well. Just want to highlight a few of the things that have happened just in a couple of years since you stepped down as editor-in-chief. One of them, and I don't know if you noticed, but last year we started adding manuscripts from the ASCO thematic meetings. So ASCO GI and ASCO GU, something we had certainly talked about in the past, but had lacked bandwidth to really do. And they seem to be pretty widely accessed.
That's fantastic. Yes, I do remember talking about the coverage of the thematic meetings. And you're right. This takes a long time to sort of concentrate on the annual meeting. It may seem like everything happens in the span of like 8 weeks.
It does feel like that sometimes.
Right? But this is actually something that starts a year before. Once the education program is set, we're in the room when they set it. But then it's really chasing down manuscripts and then making sure that they're peer reviewed, because the peer review is still really important. And then making sure that any revisions are made before it's finalized and goes press. That is a many month process. So when we're trying to introduce, we should also do ASCO GU, or the questions was, how do you want to do that given this very, very involved process going forward? So I'm glad you were able to figure it out.
Well, it's challenging. I don't think people realize quite the compressed timeline for these. You know, the education session and authors and invited faculty are picked in the fall. And then basically you have to start turning in your manuscripts in February, March of the following year. And so it's a really tight turnaround for this. When we talk about the ASCO thematic meetings, it's an even tighter window.
Right, exactly.
And so it's challenging to get that moving. But I was really, really proud that we were able to pull that off.
Well, congratulations again. And I think that is a necessary step, because so much of what's going on in the various disease management sites is only covered cursorily through the annual meeting itself. I mean, there's just so much science breaking at any one time that I think if we want to comprehensively catalog the year in review in oncology, it kind of behooves us to do that.
Some other things that are coming up is because we now have manuscripts that are going to be coming in year round, and just to kind of make it easier on the editorial staff, we're going to be forming an editorial board. And in addition to our pool of reviewers who get FASCO points, and please feel free to go online to the ASCO volunteer portal and sign up if you are interested in participating. So moving forward, I'm really excited to see where things are going to go.
Well, that's great. That's great. And I do remember talking about whether or not we needed to have an editorial board. At least when I was there, having this carried by 3 people was always better than having it carried by 1 person. And I think as you expand the potential for submissions, it will be very helpful to have that input for sure. And then it gives another opportunity for more members to get involved in ASCO as well.
Absolutely. People want involvement, and so happy to provide that.
Yes.
Is there anything we didn't cover that you would like to mention before we wrap up?
Well, I will say this, that ASCO and through its publications not only has had this real emphasis on multidisciplinary managements of cancers, especially where it was relevant, but it also always had a stand to ensure representation was front and center in who wrote for us. And I think every president, every chair that I've worked with naturally embraced that idea of representation. And I think it has been a distinct honor to say that during my tenure as EIC, we have always had a plethora of voices, of authors from different countries, of genders that have participated in the construction of those books. And it stands as a testament that we are a global community and we will always be one.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm happy to continue that as we move forward. Well, Don, thank you. It's been great speaking with you. You played such a pivotal role in the EdBook's evolution, and I'm so glad you were able to join me for our inaugural episode.
Well, I'm just tickled that you asked me to be your first guest. Thank you so much, Nate.
And I also want to thank our listeners for joining us today. We hope you'll join us again for more insightful views on topics you'll be hearing at the education sessions from ASCO meetings throughout the year, as well as our periodic deep dives on advances that are shaping modern oncology. Have a great day.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions.